Hi guys, welcome back to the channel Tech Concept with Ume. Now, this is the second part of our last series on the relational database. Before I go any further, I want to request that you subscribe to the channel. If you look to the bottom right of the viewport of this video, you will see a red subscription watermark. If you take your mouse and hover around the red subscription watermark, subscription button will appear. Please do well to subscribe. Also, I want to request that you hit the notification, icon, as this will enable you to be notified when new videos are uploaded. And finally, please hit the like icon. Please hit the like icon, as this will enable or prompt YouTube to recommend the videos more. So, in the first part of this series, we prepared the foundation for implementing CRUD functions using Python and PostgreSQL. Now, in this video, we will be implementing the create and read aspects of our CRUD function. I will not rehash the importance of understanding CRUD functions, as this has been emphasized in the first part of this series. I will only reiterate that for most web applications and functions, you know, which work alongside databases, CRUD is an integral part of their interaction. Now, for this task, we will begin by navigating to our PostgreSQL environment. And once there, we're going to log in. Right. So I'm going to start by saying PostgreSQL user Postgres prompts me for my password, which I'll provide. Now we're going to navigate to the database which we created specifically for this series, which is test_py. So I'm going to use the \C, which stands for \connect. And then I'm going to mention database test_py. And I get the output that reads, you are now connected to database test_py as user Postgres. What we're going to do next is a select command. So I'm going to say select all from students. Select all, let's keep our convention, from students, and end with the semicolon. And here you will see that we have 0 rows in our student table. I feel like this is important to emphasize because what we intend to do with this video is to create, or to insert rather, to insert records into our students table from the PyCharm environment and not from the Postgres environment. Okay, but also we want to do a select command from the PyCharm environment. We'll do a select command from here after we're done inserting, but we'll also demonstrate the select from the PyCharm environment. So the reason I have done this is so that you can see that the table initially is empty before we commence, writing our syntax in PyCharm. So I'm going to navigate to PyCharm now that we have, established that our table is empty. I'm going to minimize this screen and we're going to go to the PyCharm environment. Right, so we have our PyCharm opened up here. I should state that I have written out the codes already. And the reason I have done this is so that we can speed up the process, right? As opposed to me having to type from the beginning. I have already written them out. As such, what I'll be doing is just explaining the codes that have been written out, which I believe will speed up the process. Okay, so obviously here we have import cycle 2, which imports the driver to be used. Next to that, we have what you will call a try block. And this block lets you test a block of code for errors. As such, the subsequent lines beneath, which are these lines beneath, okay, all the way to accept. All right. The subsequent lines beneath the try block are tested for errors. And the block is used alongside this except block. Okay. Uh, if errors are noticed, it will be flagged by, the exception block. All right. If errors are noticed, it will be flagged by the exception block. So just note that these work together. The try and the accept. Okay. So we're going back to the top. Next, we have our parameter definition or connection string. We did highlight this in the first video of this series. Now, as indicated in that video, this will open a connection to the database that one hopes to connect to. Test underscore py in this case. Now, if the connection is opened successfully, it creates a connection object, and you need to ensure that your parameters are defined properly using information relevant to your settings. For instance, we're not going to have the same password, okay? You need to note what your host is. This is localhost I'm using, all right? You need to note what port you're using. Mine is the default port of 5432. Just ensure that all parameters defined are in line with your settings in Postgres. Okay, that's important to note. Next to that, we have code that helps us to create a cursor. So this creates a cursor which will be used throughout the database's connection with Python. All right. Below that, we have our SQL, statements. Okay, so I have highlighted that. And this code assigns the insert SQL statement to be executed. It assigns it to a variable. So here, the SQL statement is assigned to what we may call, the Postgres insert query, right? Variable. Now, the attributes to be populated are given placeholders, which will hold the values to be inserted. As you can see, we have placeholders here to hold the values to be inserted. Right. Below that, we have another variable defined, right, which actually, lists our records. Lists our records, okay? We assign that to that variable. So this code assigns the records to be entered into the student table to a variable. Here, the records are assigned to the records to insert variable. You can see that, which is what we labeled it as, records to insert variable. Now, below that, we have a method, all right? So the cursor or executes many method, right? So this is a method similar to the execute method. Remember, there's a slight difference. Here we have execute many. In the previous example or in the previous video, we used the execute method. All right, so the execute many method is similar to the execute method. The difference here is that this method is intended to execute an SQL statement that traverses okay, or scans many rows. And the SQL statement is executed against all parameter sequences or mappings found in the sequence. And this will enable the insertion of many records at once. Now, the cursor that execute many method is used to provide instruction for execution of the SQL statement, however, represented with the variables to which the SQL statement, is assigned or are assigned. So you note here we didn't enter the records. So with our execute many, method, here we are just using these variables as representations of what we want to execute. All right. So as opposed to entering the SQL statement, here we just use the variable name. And as opposed to entering the records, right, we just use the variable name as well. Okay. Below that, we have, you know, the con.commit method. And this method commits the SQL transaction that is carried out in the execute method. Okay, remember we said whenever you're making changes with respect to transactions, it's important to commit. Whenever you're making modifications, a delete, an edit, an insert, okay, it's important to commit. Next, we have a cursor attribute. We have a cursor attribute. So this is known as row count. And the attribute here is assigned to a variable called count, which is used to count the number of rows inserted with the execute many method. And this attribute is assigned to a variable called count. Right. Keep that in mind. Next, we have the use of our print function again, okay, to specify a print statement. So here a print function is applied to the output of the row count instruction. The row count output and subsequent text indicated in quotation marks. You can see the text indicated in quotation marks, right? That are displayed as a statement during runtime. So when we run our code, that will be displayed. Then we have talked briefly about the exception, or except block. Okay. So, which is just below our print, function or statement. All right. And our except block is used to catch all errors in the lines of preceding code above it, all the way to the try block. And it is used in collaboration as indicated with the try block. Okay. Um, the try block or try statement will attempt to implement the codes below it. So all the codes below the try block, it will attempt to implement. Okay. Except an error is noticed. Okay. So we'll try to implement all these except an error is noticed. So we need to take note of that. There are various types of exception errors. However, the cyclope2.error, which is what is used here, cyclope2.error, okay, is the base class or foundational class of all exceptions. Right. Now, below that, we have an if-con statement. We have an if-con statement, and this statement simply checks if the connection is opened. Okay. And if it is, the statement below it in the print function. So look at that. We have another print function, okay, below that, which indicates another statement. Okay. So the statement below in the print function is ignored. Otherwise, the error statement is printed. Note that. Right. Then finally, we have our finally statement below that. Okay. And the finally keyword is used alongside the try and except blocks as well, which we have just talked about. And it defines a block of code that will be executed whether or not an error is discovered, through the exception block. Now, the blocks of code defined below the finally keyword are as follows. So, if connection is open, okay, um, cursor.close and then connection.close. Okay, and this is, simple instruction to check whether, the connection object is open. And if it is open, the instruction further indicates that the cursor and the connection objects should be closed. So as suggested in the last, video, it is considered good practice to release the resources, or resource when it is not being used. So we should close our connections, close our cursors when they are not being used. All right. We have another print function, okay, to end our, insert code. And this is a simple optional print function to display the following text in quotation or quotes inside the print function, indicating that the PostgreSQL connection is closed. So that's the end of our first, code bit for insert. So I'm going to scroll up so that you can have opportunity to see everything at a glance as well. All right, I'm just going to do this for a number of seconds so you can see all the way to that point. And in the event that you may want to pause the video to type, okay, you're able to do that. All right, you can see it at a glance. Then I'm going to scroll down as well so that you can see the bottom part. All right, or the end of the code. Right. So I'll give it a few more seconds and then I'm going to run the code. I believe this is sufficient time for you to have, taking note of the sequence of or blocks of code. So now I'm going to run our insert command. So I'm going to click on the insert tab just to make sure we're, positioned on it. I'm going to right click and I'm going to select run from the options that appear. Okay. And you will see 5 records inserted successfully into student. All right. Now, I am going to go back to our PostgreSQL environment because that's a good way to check, right? I'm going to go back to our PostgreSQL environment and I am going to do a select command from here. So I'm going to say select all from student. And when I run that, you will see that we have 5 records inserted as opposed to the previous, run which we did where we had 0 rows returned. Now we have 5 records returned. And you saw that we did not, you know, perform any insert functions from our PostgreSQL environment. Everything was done from Python. So that's the first part. So this constitutes the create part of our CRUD function, right? So create part is done where we insert records into, our database, howbeit from a different environment. you know, a Python oriented environment in this instance. Now we're going to go back to our PyCharm environment to run our select command from there. Right. So here you will note that I also have, you'll note that I also have our select, command, performed. So I'm going to go back here. Right. We have our select code written out as well. Okay. So here we go. I'm going to run through it just like I did with our insert example. So obviously, import scikub2 will help us to import the driver to be used. Next, we define a function, right, called getStudent, which when called will display the list which the SQL statement requests. Okay. Next, we have an ordinary statement, which is really not part of the code. Okay, just for instruction for the person who's coding, right? But really not part of the code. You can see we have 3 quotes before the statement and 3 quotes afterwards, which indicates that this is a statement. Below that, we have our try block. As indicated, the try block lets you test a block of code for errors. All right. And we have explained what that works alongside with the accept block. Okay. Below that, we have our parameter definition. Okay. Our parameter definition here. So connection is created through this parameter definition. And if successful, a connection object is created. All right. Next, we create a cursor. I'm not going to rehash that. You can look at the first video or the first example from this video to see what our cursor does, which helps us to traverse. Okay. Then we have our, method for execution here. All right. So the cursor that executes, okay, we have explained what that does. Um, and like we did indicate, it's intended to execute an SQL statement. All right. So embedded in the parenthesis is the select, all from student statements. Select all from student statements. Okay, so you can see that in quotes. All right. Below that, we have a print function. Below that, we have a print function. And this is a print function intended to display the number of students whose records are to be returned in the results set. All right, attached to the statement to be printed is the cursor.rowCount attribute. The cursor.rowCount attribute, which returns a count of the total number of records. Then below that, we have 4 lines of code that work together. We have 4 lines of code that work together. I am just going to highlight them. All right. So I have highlighted those 4 rows of code. And these 4 rows of code, like I did indicate, they work together to display all the rows of the returned, result set. All right. In the PyCharm integrated development environment. Now, the first code, so let's look at the first line, is cursor.fetch1. Okay, so let's go back there. The first line of that, all right, cursor.fetch1 is, a method which is assigned to a variable called row. As you can see here, assigned to a variable called row. And the cursor.fetch1 method fetches the next row of the records that have been inserted into our, SQL um, table or our database table, right? Um, the second and third block of code uses the while statement, right? Second and third blocks of code uses the while statement and print function to indicate that as long as there are more rows to be returned, they should be printed. Okay, so where the second and third? So we have this and this, which will help us to ensure that as long as there are more rows to be printed, they should be printed. All right. And the last block of code ensures that the returned rows are printed only once. That's this next cursor.fetch1 ensures that the rows are printed only once. All right. Then below that, right, we have a method cursor.close. Cursor.close. I'm going to highlight that as well. This method using the cursor object provides instruction to close the cursor. All right. And below that, we have our except block. Below that, we have our except block. And we also have a print function, which works alongside it for this example. And these two lines of code are used together. The first block is referred to as the except block, obviously. We've talked about that. And it is used to catch all errors in the lines of preceding code above it. It is used in collaboration with the try keyword. Now, the second block is a print function instructing that error be printed if an error is indeed noticed. Then we have a finally keyword stated below that. We have a finally keyword stated below that. And the finally keyword here will work alongside the next two lines of code or two rows of code, you know, stating that if connection is still open, okay, the connection should be closed. All right, if connection is still open, the connection should be closed. But also, the finally keyword works alongside the try and except blocks. Okay, it's important to keep that in mind. All right, then we have a last block of code just before we state um, the function which we have created. All right, for it to run. Okay, we have a final block of code if name equals to main. If name equals to main. And this code is used to check if the module being run in this script is imported or not. Okay, it's used to check if the module being run in this script is imported or not. Okay. Um, and finally, we have our function, which was defined up here. All right. Um, so just an indication that our function should be run. Now I'm going to do the same thing that I did with our insert example. All right. So I'm going to scroll to the top of this so that you can see at one glance what the code looks like. And I'm going to leave this for a number of seconds. And then I'm going to scroll down as well, just for us to see the end of this code. Okay, I want to presume that everyone has been able to, you know, take a snapshot or see at a glance what the code looks like, right? um, row by row, right? I think another thing I should emphasize here is that indentation is very important. Indentation is very important, especially when using Python, right? So you need to take note of that. The indentings, all right, also determine whether or not your code is going to run, right? Okay, so now that we have this done, I am also going to do the same thing we did with our insert. I'm going to run it. So here I'm going to say run select. And as you can see, the number of students, 5, okay, emanating from this print statement, the number of students, and then using the cursor.row counts attribute. All right, so that gives us that the number of students, 5, right? That's our SQL statement, select all from students, okay, which we are trying to run using this function that we created, define get students, right? And you can see our 5 records displayed here. So this is the read part of our CRUD function. Remember we said for this video, we're going to do the create part, which was, represented by our insert records. And we were going to do the read part, represented by our select functions. In the last video of the database series, we're coming to the end of the database series. So the last video of the database series, we're going to be doing the um, update and the delete, parts of the CRUD functions. So thank you again for tuning in. Again, I want to reiterate that you should please subscribe to the channel. Um, I want to also plead with you to hit the like icon. This will prompt YouTube to recommend the videos more. Okay. So I will see you in the last video. We need to remember as well that this is just one series, or this is just one module, right? So this channel is going to be covering a lot of other things that are technology related. So I need you to, keep that in mind as well. Thank you for tuning in.